And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. William Atlas Longacre II, who is former head of the Department of Anthropology here at the U of A, and Reeker Professor Emeritus.
Sorry I have no PowerPoint or pretty slides. I gave all of my slides to the ASM.
Yes, he did.
Patrick wouldn't let me use any of it. Also, I'm having terrible problems because I'm having terrible problems. Can you hear me? With all this wind, the pollen has taken away my voice almost. So although I have no no slides to show, I do have a couple of props. What a great idea to bring all the field school folks in one room. Let's talk about lots of fun things. I like to tell stories.
Can I help you with your mic?
Don't electrocute me. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Uncle Willy goes high tech. I'd like to echo some of the things that Raymond Thompson's told us. The Arizona Field Schools have always been recognized as among the finest in the United States. They've been identified as always being cutting edge in their approaches to teaching and research. The contents of the sites have changed very little in the nearly 100 years of Arizona Field Schools. But the theory guiding and stimulating the approaches to teaching has changed dramatically. And I think we'll get a feeling for that in the course of these talks. We've been identified as the leaders in the field, and all the directors you will hear from today represent the best in that tradition. My job here, as I was given it by our distinguished leader, Diane Austin, was to discuss Grasshopper in Vernon, which was taken over by the U of A for the final year of Paul Martin's NSF grant in the early 70s. It was an undergraduate field school, and I became director of that project as well as Grasshopper for 1 year. The field director was John Fritz, and it also starred a super cast including Dave Wilcox, Gene Roby, and others. Grasshopper had become a graduate student training experience a little bit earlier. So what is remembering the good old days, and the initial appearance of what came to be called the New Archaeology, or the processual archaeology, began to appear around 1960-ish. field of archaeology was ready for change, and the winds of change were already in place by the 1930s with the onslaught of what I have called the Pluckhome-Taylor attack on archaeology of that era. They argued that archaeology was out of step with the exciting developments in general anthropology, which saw the gradual demise of Boasian historical particularism and the emergence of new theoretical approaches such as structural functionalism, neo-evolutionary theory, and cultural ecology. By the 1950s, we see the first attempt to reconstruct prehistoric social organization since the 19th century. This was the chapter in a site report by Martin and Ronaldo. By then, Gordon Willy had invented settlement pattern archaeology, accounting for changes in settlement distributions and configurations in social and political terms. The focus was beginning to shift towards an explicit concern with the behavior and organization of peoples in the past. The person largely identified with this new archaeology, of course, is Louis R. Binford, and who joined the faculty at the University of Chicago in 1962. He brought a mix of cultural ecology, quantitative methods with sampling and neo-evolutionary thought, reflecting his experiences with the faculty at Michigan, including Leslie White and Al Spalding. This was the madness that the University of Arizona inadvertently introduced into their faculty in 1964 by hiring a very young-looking William Longacre to join the faculty. My first summer at Grasshopper was 1965, and Ray alluded to that with the appearance of Linda Bird Johnson and her group of Secret Service and staff. It was a very interesting experience. I was delighted to read lengthy interviews with me published in the Globe paper by a gentleman that I never met. Anyway, now, being a rabid new archaeologist, whatever that means, one of the things that I confronted at Grasshopper was this enormous site with enormous variability in the distribution of rooms and groups of rooms, with a remnant of a small stream in between. The problems of developing a useful sampling design for a site of that magnitude. And that led to the initiation of what came to be called the cornering project. What we did was excavate two diagonally opposite corners of every room in the site. That first of all gave us a reasonably accurate picture of the variation of sizes and shapes of rooms, but it also allowed us to work on the construction sequence, looking at if two walls came together and the stones in the walls interlaced or bonded, then those two walls had to have been built at about the same time. If, on the other hand, the walls abutted, they could have been built at the same time, but more likely it represented two different periods of construction. Added to this, we could identify a style of wall that was designed to face the out of doors, very different from a style of wall designed to face inside. It was the beginning of this. I initiated in 1966, and by 1968 we were just beginning to do it. And I got a letter from my boss, Dr. Raymond Thompson, telling me that there was this enormous conference that was scheduled to be held in Flagstaff of the Union of Prehistoric and Protohistoric Sciences from all over the world. And Ray told me that Irving Rouse, the archaeologist at Yale, was supposed to participate, but he couldn't do it at the last minute. So Ray said, "You must replace him." Beyond that, I had like 3 days to get an abstract in for a paper, and then shortly after that to go to Flagstaff and participate with this incredible array of world-famous scholars from all over the place. So I decided I would use that as a platform to initiate a discussion about my plans for the sampling design. And so I went to the conference, and being nobody, being a person with no recognition from anybody of the high quality of the prehistorians that I was confronting, they didn't take me very seriously. There was another chap who had the identical experience. He was a young British archaeologist who had been tapped at the last minute to replace some famous Brit. And he came to Flagstaff, and he too was given a not very enthusiastic welcome. So the people in charge, there was a hierarchy of name recognition that reflected as to where people got to spend the night. If you were really famous, you were in the cabin right there at the Museum of Northern Arizona. If you were not so famous, but still up there, you got into this big hotel. I think it was called the Monteverde or Monteverde Hotel. But for the Brit and me, since we were nobody, they put us in a crummy, cheap motel by the railroad that shook every time the train came. So we shared that room. His name was David Clark. And I hope all of you recognize that name. And we laughed about our predicament. And David had brought an advanced copy of a book that he had just published, or was in process of publishing, called Analytical Archaeology. And nobody seemed very interested in it except for me. And in fact, he talks about me in the book. And I'd never heard of him, but he knew something of me. So he decided to give me the advanced copy. And it says, to Bill Longacre, to promote the cause of international diffusion, David Clark, September 1968. The paper I gave was never published, nor was his, in the proceedings of this august institution. Who cared about statistics and sampling in those days? And in fact, the paper I gave disappeared for many, many, many years. Some of you might remember things like carbon paper and mimeograph and things like that. There were no personal computers. There was no Xerox. As I recall, my paper was the version that's purple, that horrible, I don't remember what it's called. But finally, with the help of the wonderful people at the ASM library, we tracked it down, at the Museum of Northern Arizona, which had an actual copy. And now it's in the ASM library, so if you're interested in a bit of trivia, you can read about this, this project and its outcome. But some of the things that we began to introduce at Grasshopper that reflected some of these new interests were focused on data recovery at the site. We began to collect samples from room floors and brownstone washes and so on of pollen, as well as introducing chemical water flotation to recover carbonized seeds and other organic material, including tiny little bones of fishes and other animals. In terms of ceramic recording, we introduced the recording of size and shape data from sherds. We changed the excavation to focus on natural and cultural levels. And in the midst of all this, I had the great pleasure to meet for the first time Stan and Eleanor and John Olson. Again, I got a lovely note from Ray Thompson telling me that Stan Olson, this wonderful zooarchaeologist, was going to come to Grasshopper, and please be nice to him. I was on the site that day. We were working with Dave Tuggle on a kiva. We were doing fine screening of ash levels and so on, using window screen. And we were pulling up literally hundreds of tiny little bones, putting them carefully in the coin envelopes. We had these big boxes of coin envelopes. And this apparition drove up on the road. It was a Volkswagen bus. It was covered with antlers and horns and body parts of various creatures. And I thought, that's got to be the Olsen. And they bounced out of their car, the bus, and came over to us and introduced themselves. And he seemed a little bit depressed. His trip that particular summer was to find evidence of the remains of reptiles, amphibians, and fishes in southwestern sites. And he had been going all over the place looking at museum collections and visiting excavations and wasn't finding any. So he was really an unhappy camper. And I told him, well, I said, well, I have no idea what we have here, but we have, literally thousands of little tiny funny bones. So I gave him some coin envelopes. He put one of his fingers here on his hand, and he called John. He said, John, look, it's a blood balloon. I mean, he just went hysterical. We had to run the generator late that night because he was in the lab with those strange binocular things, identifying all of these wonderful amphibians, and fishes, and reptiles of various sorts. So that was my meeting with the Olsons. And it was developed into a friendship that has lasted all these many years. That's another great treasure of being involved with the field school. It's a lodestone that attracts scholars who come to visit, and the result is wonderful friendships. I'll end with another story that illustrates another kind of episode that sometimes happens. That first summer of 1966, I returned to the campus to begin teaching for the fall semester. And again, I got a note calling me into the department head's office. I thought, oh God, what have I done now? And I was confronted with a criticism about my first year as directing the Archaeological Field School. And I was presented with a body of data, facts, information, all during the years of Point of Pines, speaking of a very expensive thing to do to run a field school. They had figured out how much it cost to move 1 cubic meter of dirt. And they did the same thing with the grasshopper results, unbeknownst to me, something I would never think to do. I mean, it's totally irrelevant as far as I was concerned. But I was confronted with this, and I was asked to explain why it costs so much per cubic meter of dirt at Grasshopper compared to earlier field school. My first thought was to suggest they buy a tractor. That's an important thing, or a backhoe. But I had to try to come to grips with the fact that these new methods and techniques that were being introduced were indeed slowing down the process of excavation. But I did argue that the amount of information that came from it more than made up for the difference in the tonnage of dirt that was moved out. I'll end with one little funny story that comes out of the field school experience. And that is, why did I get the name Uncle Willy? Some of you may know I'm often referred to. In fact, Diane Austin refuses to call me Bill. She calls me Uncle Willy. This all came from those early years at Grasshopper. I was not that old when I took over Grasshopper, in my late 20s actually. And I had the great fortune to not look even that old. So the students had a difficult time dealing with me. Here was this kid who was in charge. And they didn't feel comfortable calling me Professor or Dr. Longacre. And they felt terrible at the thought of calling me Bill. So what they did what anthropologists call assigning me fictive kinship. So they made me an honorary uncle. And I guess I was aware of it, sort of. But it all came home to me one day at Grasshopper when I was in the office doing something. And a graduate student from another school had driven in to see this place at the Archaeological Field School. And so one of my students at Grasshopper brought him to the office. And there was a knock on the door, and I said, come in, and a stranger came in with my student. And the fellow said to the student, Jim Smith, this is Dr. William Longacre. And he turned to me and he said, Uncle Willy, this is Jim Smith. Hey, like that. So there's another great advantage to being involved in the field school. You become a fictive kin of students. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction, J. Jefferson Reed, who, after they threw me out of Grasshopper, became the director. Actually, we overlapped, he and Steph, for many years in the work at Grasshopper. Jeff is recently retired. He's a distinguished professor at the University of Arizona, and introduced the tenets of behavioral archaeology at Grasshopper, which I'm sure we're going to hear about right now. So Jeff?